Madison and Derek Harlow were the kind of couple people envied. High school sweethearts with 2 kids, a beautiful home, and smiles that never hinted at the storm quietly building behind their front door. Until one morning, Madison called 911, claimed her husband was attacking her, and then shot him dead while still on the line. Madison and Derek Harlow had what many would call a picture-perfect life. Nestled in a quiet Colorado suburb, their home sat at the corner of a tree-lined street, surrounded by trimmed hedges and flower beds that Madison cared for herself. They had 2 children, both under 10, who attended the local elementary school. The family drove a modest SUV, participated in neighborhood potlucks, and waved at passing cars from their front porch. To anyone looking from the outside, their life was simple, happy, and uneventful. Madison had met Derek in high school. They were young then, carefree, full of hope, and after graduating they married quickly. Madison never went to college, choosing instead to support Derek while he pursued his degree in software engineering. Eventually he landed a work-from-home job with a Denver-based tech company, earning a stable income that allowed Madison to stay home with the kids. Later she took up a part-time job at a nearby veterinary clinic. She was known as gentle, soft-spoken, and helpful. People trusted her. The local pastor once described her as the kind of woman who lights up a room without ever asking for attention. Derek was quiet but kind. He played guitar, volunteered with his son's little league team, and mowed his elderly neighbor's lawn every Saturday. If there were disagreements between the couple, no one ever heard them. But something was changing beneath the surface. Friends who had once received birthday texts from Derek noticed the messages stopped coming. He declined more and more invitations to social events. Madison, too, began to withdraw. She started missing work without much explanation. Some said she seemed distracted. Others noticed how she had lost weight. She smiled less. She was still polite, still engaged with the community. But something about her was different. The kids, though always clean and well-fed, didn't talk much about their parents. They were quiet in ways that made teachers wonder. One child drew a picture of a house split in half with the word alone written above it. A school counselor made a note of it, but no formal report was filed. Those close to the couple assumed it was just the weight of adult life, bills, kids, stress. Nobody imagined that something darker was brewing inside the Harlow household. There were no police reports, no calls for help, no visible signs of danger. It was a house where the lights were always on by 6 p.m. and where Halloween decorations went up every October without fail. Normal, predictable, safe. But sometimes the calmest waters hide the deepest unrest. Behind the closed doors of that suburban home, something had started to unravel. Derek had grown distant, cold even. He stopped, greeting Madison in the mornings. He slept in the guest room more often. Meanwhile, Madison had begun to keep a locked drawer in her bedside table. No one knew what was inside, and no one asked. The illusion held strong until one fall morning when Madison's voice broke through. A 911 call, and the truth shattered the peaceful mask they had both worn for far too long. At exactly 7:42 a.m. on the morning of October 12th, the Jefferson County Emergency Call Center received a 911 call from Madison Harlow. Her voice was shaky, panicked, rising and falling between sobs and gasps. She said her husband was attacking her. In the background, muffled sounds echoed through the line, thuds, footsteps, and what sounded like raised voices, though none of it was entirely clear. The dispatcher, trained to handle panic and confusion, asked her to stay on the line to describe what was happening to get to safety if she could. Then came a loud crash, followed by the sound of something falling. Madison cried out, and a sharp, short scream pierced the audio. Just seconds later, a single gunshot rang through the call. Then silence. Long, chilling silence. The dispatcher repeated her name several times. Madison didn't respond right away. There were rustling sounds, a creaking floorboard, and the soft buzz of static on the line. Finally, after nearly 30 seconds, Madison's voice came back, but this time it was quieter, almost distant. She said her husband was down. She said she shot him. She claimed it was self-defense. Her words were scattered, breathless, filled with disbelief, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. When officers arrived at the house just 10 minutes later, Madison was waiting at the door. Her face was pale, her hair messy, and her hands clutched the phone as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply pointed them toward the living room. First responders entered quickly and found Derek Harlow lying face down on the floor. He was barefoot, wearing pajama pants and a plain t-shirt. A pool of blood had spread beneath his head. He had been shot once, in the back of the skull. A handgun rested on a nearby end table, neatly placed, not dropped or flung in panic. The entire room was eerily tidy. A plate of half-eaten toast sat on the coffee table. A mug of coffee, still warm, was placed carefully beside it. Nothing was overturned. No furniture was broken. There were no signs of a struggle, no scattered belongings, no blood trails or defensive wounds. The officers were trained to process trauma, to comfort the shaken, but even they noticed that something about the scene felt wrong. Madison was cooperative but subdued. She repeated that Derek had tried to hurt her. She said she had no choice. She never raised her voice. She never asked about his condition. The dispatcher's recording of the call was reviewed almost immediately. It became the centerpiece of the early investigation. Audio technicians enhanced the background sounds, slowed the tape, and analyzed the timing of every noise. The more closely they examined it, the more questions arose. The placement of the gun, the lack of physical evidence supporting a struggle, and the calmness that followed the gunshot, all of it began to chip away at the story Madison had told. From the moment she hung up that phone, nothing about the tragedy seemed to match the tale of a desperate woman defending her life. After the initial shock wore off and the crime scene was secured, detectives began piecing together what had really happened inside the Harlow residence that morning. Madison's account didn't add up. She had claimed that Derek had attacked her in a fit of rage, that she had no choice but to defend herself, that she feared for her life. But the evidence painted a different picture, one that grew darker with each passing hour. Crime scene technicians noted immediately that the room where Derek died showed no signs of violence. Nothing was disturbed, and no physical evidence supported a struggle. There were no bruises on Madison, no scratches, no torn clothing, and no defensive wounds on Derek's hands. It was as if the confrontation she described had never happened. Investigators found the breakfast Derek had started, half-eaten toast, a still steaming cup of coffee, left untouched in the living room. Derek hadn't been preparing to fight. He had been preparing for the day ahead. The autopsy confirmed the suspicions. Derek had been shot from behind, the bullet entering at a downward angle. According to the medical examiner, he was seated or kneeling when it happened. That detail made Madison's story even harder to believe. Shooting someone in the back of the head in the middle of an assault scenario is almost unheard of. It wasn't the wound of someone acting in fear. It was precise, calculated. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Derek had installed a small security camera in his home office just weeks before his death. He hadn't told anyone about it. It wasn't connected to the main home security system, and it had its own independent power source and memory card. Officers found the device tucked into a corner shelf, pointed toward the hallway. While the footage didn't capture the shooting itself, it showed key moments in the hour before the 911 call. Derek was seen sipping coffee, scrolling through his laptop, and chatting briefly on the phone. He appeared calm and relaxed. There was no hint of tension or violence. Madison passed by once, walking slowly, staring into the room. She said nothing. Even more concerning was that this wasn't the first time Derek had seemed uneasy. Friends and family later told police that he had become withdrawn. In private conversations, he mentioned feeling like he was being watched or manipulated. He never accused Madison directly, but his tone had changed in recent months. He seemed on edge. He had also recently updated his life insurance policy, increasing the payout and naming Madison as the sole beneficiary, a move that would later raise serious questions about motive. Investigators pulled Madison's phone, records, emails, and computer search history. They wanted to understand what led up to that fatal morning. What they found hinted at a story far more complex than a sudden burst of violence. There were no reports of past domestic abuse, no visits from police, no neighbors who heard fighting. But the deeper they looked, the more it became clear. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment tragedy. This was something planned, something that had been building slowly and silently behind the walls of a house that looked to the outside world perfectly normal. As detectives continued to investigate, a disturbing new side of Madison Harlow began to emerge, one that no neighbor, co-worker, or friend could have imagined. Behind the calm demeanor and soft-spoken kindness, Madison had been living a secret, life filled with deception, obsession, and calculated moves that pointed directly to premeditation. Police began their digital forensics work by diving into Madison's devices. Her phone, laptop, and tablet were all seized and searched. It didn't take long for investigators to find a pattern that unraveled the entire narrative she had constructed. There were hundreds of deleted messages and encrypted emails exchanged with a man named Ryan Deller, a former auto mechanic who lived in New Mexico. Their relationship had started in an online trauma support group where people shared personal stories of loss, betrayal, and abuse. Madison joined the group under a fake name. What started as empathy soon turned into something more. The emails between Madison and Ryan were emotional, romantic, and eventually conspiratorial. Ryan had a criminal record for assault, vandalism, and intimidation. He had served short stints in jail and had been under investigation before for suspected stalking. In one particularly damning message, Ryan wrote, "If he makes you suffer, maybe it's time he's gone." Madison replied, "Some days I imagine a different life, a life where I wake up and breathe again." The messages only grew more intense over time. They discussed running away, starting fresh, leaving the past behind. But Derek was always the obstacle. Madison never outright said she planned to kill him, but there were hints, searches for accidental death methods, how to stage a break-in, and even can 911 calls be used as evidence. These search terms weren't months old. They were days, sometimes hours before Derek was killed. Investigators also uncovered several journal entries saved in a password-protected file on Madison's laptop. In them, she wrote cryptic thoughts about feeling trapped, about Derek suffocating her. But there was no mention of physical abuse, no mention of calls for help, bruises, or fear for safety. Instead, there were entries about power, about reclaiming control, about creating a new beginning. One entry ended with the words, "Nothing changes unless something ends." Financial records added another layer to the story. Madison had recently opened a private checking account under her maiden name. She had withdrawn over $15,000 in small increments over a 6-week period. She'd also purchased a burner phone, prepaid credit cards, and a one-way plane ticket scheduled for 2 weeks after Derek's death. The destination? Albuquerque, where Ryan Deller lived. By the time all the evidence was gathered, a chilling portrait had formed. Madison had not acted in fear. She had acted with purpose. There was no sign that Derek had been violent. No calls to friends, no reports, no journal entries describing actual abuse. What they had instead was a woman who built a second life, in secret, nurtured a dangerous connection with a known criminal, and then tried to erase her husband under the cover of a 911 call that she hoped would shield her from the consequences. The trial of Madison Harlow began just under a year after Derek's death. It quickly became one of the most watched cases in the state, with true crime forums and media outlets dissecting every development. From the outside, Madison still looked like the grieving widow, composed, quiet, and neatly dressed. But inside the courtroom, the prosecution laid out a version of her that was colder, more deliberate, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The case rested heavily on a few key pieces of evidence. The enhanced 911 call was played in full, including the chilling final moments. Technicians had filtered out the background noise to clarify what had once sounded like a gasp or a cry. Slowed down and amplified, it was unmistakable. Just seconds before the gunshot, Madison could be heard whispering, "This ends now." The jury sat frozen. No one had expected the words to be so clear or so damning. It wasn't the voice of a woman afraid for her life. It was the voice of someone making a final, irreversible decision. The prosecution argued that Madison had carefully staged the entire scene to look like self-defense. They pointed to the neatly placed weapon, the lack of injury on her body, and the calmness that followed the shooting. They showed a timeline of her internet searches and financial transactions, all painting a picture of someone preparing to leave her life behind and start over, with a large life insurance payout and a new man waiting on the other side. The defense, however, tried to shift the narrative. They leaned heavily on Madison's journal entries and her conversations with Ryan, claiming they were expressions of mental trauma rather than proof of intent. They painted Derek as emotionally distant, occasionally cruel, and said that Madison had broken under years of silent pressure. They tried to introduce doubt about the context of her whispered words, suggesting they were spoken in fear, not control. But it wasn't enough. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. Madison was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ryan Della, who was arrested shortly after Madison's emails surfaced, was charged as an accessory to murder and conspiracy. Though he denied any involvement in the planning or encouragement of the crime, the jury didn't believe him. He was sentenced to 18 years. The aftermath of the trial left the community stunned. The same woman who had volunteered at school events, walked her dog through the neighborhood, and smiled politely in grocery store aisles had for months lived a double life with deadly intentions. Friends and neighbors struggled to reconcile the Madison they thought they knew with the one revealed in court. The house where Derek died was eventually sold. The children were placed in the care of relatives out of state. To this day, the 911 call remains one of the most haunting pieces of evidence ever used in a Colorado courtroom. A moment meant to save a life, used instead to end one and cover up the truth.